psychologists are concerned with literally, so far as we know, is the most complex thing in the universe, which is the human brain. So it's no surprise that some psychology doesn't work. Nothing is improved by not paying attention to things. And we live in a society where attention is a big problem.
Psychotherapy as itself, going week after week for decades sometimes.
I think that's a problem. It makes you dependent on the psychotherapist. You're clearly not making progress because otherwise you wouldn't keep going, right? Because either you can solve the problem, you're making progress, or you don't. I think that the biggest misconception is that
Massimo Pigliucci, thank you so much for being here.
oh, it's a pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Many people are unhappy these days. What's the biggest misconception that the self-help industry is spreading about mental health, in your opinion?
Oh, that's a good question. There are so many. I think that the biggest misconception is that there is an easy and quick solution to the problem of happiness. Right? So you buy a book, and therefore, of course, you make the other richer, and then promises some kind of silver bullet or a pill that solves everything very quickly. If you only do these few things for a little bit, then you'll be fine. Happiness, on the other hand, I think, is a lifelong work. It never finishes until you're dead. In fact, Aristotle famously said that eudaimonia, which is the Greek word that often gets translated for happiness, although it actually means something a little bit more complex than that. It means flourishing, having a life that is worth living. Aristotle said that you can only determine if you really got eudaimonia by the very end of your life. In fact, you really need to be dead. Other people will judge whether you were happy or not. So I think that is a mistake. There is, especially here in the United States, but increasingly in other parts of the world, there is this notion that if only you have access to very basic, very simple knowledge and you implement it very quickly, you'll solve all your problems. It doesn't work that way.
Okay, this is fascinating, and I want to dive into it even more. But perhaps first, I just want to clarify for the audience: you are a professor. You teach in New York.
The City College in New York. I'm a professor of philosophy, although I also have a background in evolutionary biology, so I studied my academic career as a scientist.
Yeah, and you are also a best-selling author.
Yes.
Yeah, so this gives you an amazing platform, in my opinion, to give this information. So I want to dive into it. You said there's no silver bullet.
Right.
So what can one do in order to maintain better mental health?
So I think that it's very similar. The answer to that question is very similar to what would you have to do in order to maintain good physical health. In fact, the ancient Stoics often drew analogies and parallels between what we would today call mental health. They didn't call it that way, but and physical health, right? So if you want to be physically healthy, what do? Well, you have to change your pattern of behavior. Right? You have to eat healthy every day of your life, not just today and tomorrow or for the next week. You have to exercise, whether that means going on hikes or biking or running or going to the gym, whatever it is, but you have to do it. And you have to do it every week of your life, multiple times a week, ideally. You also have to take seriously preventive medicine, right? So you need to go to your doctors on a regular basis to check how you're doing. Like treat yourself as if you were a car. A car, in order to be well maintained, you need to check it, bring it to the mechanic and say, can you change the oil? Can you check whether the spark plugs are okay? And so on and so forth. It's the same thing with the human body. Human body is, biologically speaking, a really complex machine. I should say the machine analogy is problematic because actually human living organisms in general are much more complicated than any machine that we build. But for our purposes, it works well enough. So that's what you need to do. You have to decide on a course of action that you think is going to be healthy for your mind as well as for your body, and then stick to it as much as possible. Of course, we're humans, so we make mistakes. We skip the doctor's visit. We skip the gym occasionally. We overeat sometimes or drink too much or something. But that's not a problem in of itself. Fine. Okay, if today wasn't the best of days, tomorrow I'll do that. So it's the same thing in terms of mental health. You decide on what is a good philosophy of life for you. Stoicism, of course, is one example, but there are others. You decide on what is good for your long-term happiness, which may not be the same thing that is good for your short-term happiness. In fact, that's one of the problems with the word happiness. It's a little too flexible. It refers to too many different things. Right? So you could be happy in the moment, like I'm happy to see you, or I'm happy that I'm eating a gelato, or something like that. Or you could be happy about your relationship with your partner or with your children. Or you could be happy about your career, the long-term aspects of your life. What we're talking about here is the long-term aspects, not the immediate short-term rewards.
So would you say that most people are in the long term are unhappy?
Well, that's a question. That's an empirical question for psychologists, and the answer turns out to be yes. A lot of people. I mean, there is a lot of research, especially in the last 15 or 20 years, in psychology. There's been a new movement that has become popular, and I think it's very interesting. It's called positive psychology. Right. So, for more than a century, ever since William James started the whole field of psychology, psychologists have focused on what happens when things go wrong, right? So on mental, problematically mental situations or mental diseases or pathologies and so on and so forth. But then finally, I think a century later, they realized, like, wait a minute, but most people are not suffering from pathologies. Most people are just suffering from the general idea that they're not happy or that they don't know how to get happy. That's not pathology. That's just a issue of knowledge to some extent. What should I do in order to pursue a life that is worth actually pursuing? And so positive psychology, in a sense, is catching up with what philosophy has been doing for close to 2.5 millennia. That was Socrates' problem. He devoted a lot of his time to discussions about wisdom because he thought that wisdom is the real key to happiness. But that's what he was talking about. In fact, I was just coming here this morning. I was rereading one of the Platonic dialogues, the Euthydemus. And at one point in that dialogue, there is an argument that Socrates makes for why wisdom is so important and why wisdom actually brings about happiness. So people had been thinking about this stuff for a long time. But I am glad that psychologists are taking up that challenge because we don't need just philosophical insights and philosophical reasoning, as good as that may be. We also need empirical data. And if it turns out that your ideas are interesting, but then they don't match with the way the world actually works, then there's a problem and you need to correct.
Yeah, this is also a topic I wanted to dive into even a bit further down the conversation. Perhaps the epidemic of everyone I know are going to psychologists, but I don't know if they are happy. Necessarily. But I want to stick with something. In your lectures, I noticed something that was coming back a lot, which is things outside of your control and things that you can control. So, what is this aspect of mental health?
Yeah, that comes out of a specific Stoic text by Epictetus, who was early second century Stoic. Actually, to be clear, Epictetus never wrote anything down. But one of his students, a guy named Arian of Nicomedia, took down, sort of transcribed some of the conversations that Epictetus was having with his students, fortunately for us. So we have two books, the Discourses, which is a long series of 4 volumes. And then we have the very short Enchiridion, which means a manual, which is a very short summary, basically, of Epictetus's philosophy. So moving forward, I'll just refer to the Discourses and the handbook as if Epictetus had written them, but he did.
Yeah, fine by me.
I don't want some of your listeners or viewers to say, "Oh, wait a minute, but what about?" So we need to be careful about what you say in public. Okay, so the Enchiridion, the manual, starts out, it's made of 53 short sections. And I mean really short. Some of them are just one paragraph long. But the very first one starts out with a famous phrase, which is, some things are up to us and other things are not up to us. Then Epictetus goes on and lists the kinds of things that are up to us and the kinds of things that are not up to us. And I'll get to that in a moment. And then he says, if you focus your life, your attention on the things that are up to you, and you develop it, you strive to develop an attitude of acceptance and equanimity for the things that are not up to you, you will have a good life. Okay. So he tells you right there that, this is the key to happiness, as far as Epictetus at least is concerned. Now, what I just said makes some general sense, right? Essentially what he's saying is like, look, work on the things you can work on. If there's something you can't do anything about, it's completely outside of your control, then what are you going to do? You can only do two things. You can react like a child and throw a tantrum and, throw yourself on the floor, be really upset and all that sort of, but that's not going to change anything. And in fact, it's going to make it worse, because not only you cannot solve the problem because it's outside of your control, on top of that, now you feel really bad because you get angry and so on. So the only other possible reaction there is to accept things with, he says, equanimity. So with the general notion that, look, some stuff happens and I had nothing to do with it. And the best thing I can do is to react properly to what is happening, and then try to move on as much as possible. Okay. So this is not very controversial. This, in fact, the same idea shows up in different traditions. It shows up in, I think it's 8th century Buddhism. It shows up in Judaism, actually. It shows up in modern Christianity. The famous Serenity Prayer, for instance, which was written by an American theologian in the beginning of the 20th century. And it's a prayer with which people start meetings of 12-step organizations like Alcoholics Anonymous. Well, the Serenity Prayer says essentially the same thing. He asks God, in this case, because of course it's Christianity, but it asks God to give us the wisdom to tell the difference between what we can change and what we cannot change, the courage to change what we can, and the serenity to accept what we cannot. So it's essential theory. Where it gets really interesting, however, is the second section of that paragraph in the Ecaridium, where Epictetus actually tells you what he thinks is up to you and what he thinks is not up to you. That is the counterintuitive part, and I think it's the most profound part of Epictetus's philosophy. So he says the following. This is not a direct quotation, I'm paraphrasing. But he basically says, look, the only things that are up to you are your judgments about things, whether something is good or bad or neither, your decisions to act or not to act about things, and your decisions of whether these things are relevant to your happiness or not. In other words, whether you value them or you don't value them. Right? That's it. So that's the only thing. Everything else, and he lists a number of things that fall under everything else, is not up to you. And this includes your health, your career, your relationships, your wealth. And so you read this thing and you say, wait a minute, here a second. All right. So let's say, for instance, let's take health as an example. Well, surely health is at least in part up to me, right? I mean, I can do the kinds of things that I was mentioning a few minutes ago. I can go to the doctor on a regular basis. I can go to the gym and exercise. I can eat healthy and all that sort of stuff. Right. But Epictetus says, yes. But if you think about it, what are all those things you just listed? Those are your judgments and your decisions to act or not to act because certain things are of value or not. That's what you're really talking about, right? The fact, for instance, if I say I need to go to the doctor every year and get myself checked, well, that is the result. That's a judgment. It's important for me to go to the doctor. That judgment is based on my values. I value my health. So that's number two. And number three, then I decide to actually do it. I don't just think about it. I actually do it. So it's my decision to act. So those are, Epictetus agrees, those are things that are up to me. However, you can do your best about health or about wealth or about relationship or whatever it is. And still the outcome is not out to you because there are a bunch of other things you don't control, right? So I can do all of what I just said about taking care of my health, and then a stupid little virus comes in and kills me, as it might have happened with the COVID pandemic, for instance.
So it's the outcome.
Yes. So that's right. So in other words, you don't control the outcome. You control your intentions, and you better make sure that your intentions are the right ones, the more rational ones, the more wise ones. But you need to be ready with the notion that you don't control outcomes because they depend in part on a bunch of things outside of your sphere of influence.
That's amazing. And how would you say that the reverse thing of what you just said, being too much trying to control every aspect of the things that you can control, are the cause of the vast epidemic of
Yes,
unhappiness?
that's exactly right.
So
And Epictetus would not have been surprised because it's not just a modern thing. Apparently, ancient Romans 2,000 years ago were affected by the same kind of problem. That's right.
elaborate on it?
Sure. So that's right. So the idea here is that what causes happiness, or at least unhappiness, what causes unhappiness, or at least a major source of unhappiness, is that we confuse what is up to us and what is not up to us. We focus on outcomes. For instance, let me give you an example.
Yeah.
Let's say that tomorrow morning I had a job interview, and I really want the job because otherwise I wouldn't bother to go for the interview, right? I apply for the job. I've been called for the interview. Now it comes natural to us to focus on the I really want the job. But of course, the outcome is not up to us because it doesn't depend only on our efforts, which are up to us. It depends on the competition, who else is applying for the job. It depends on how the people that are offering the job perceive the match between what they want and my CV. It depends on the interviewer. Who is that person going to be? Did they get up in the morning on the wrong side of the bed? Did they have a spat with their spouse or something like that? So they're in a bad mood. All sorts of things that I absolutely have no control over. What do I have control over? Preparing myself for the interview, right? Doing myself the best to prepare for the interview. Try, and the emphasis on try to get some sleep the night before, because we know that sleeping well, it's resting, it's actually conducive to a good interview. But I said try. Why did I say try? Because again, the intention is up to me, but not the outcome. It's possible. We live in New York. It's possible that my neighbor is going to have a party tonight, way into at 3:00 in the morning, and I'm not going to be able to sleep. That's not up to me. I can try to do that, to go to bed early and so on. The following morning, tomorrow morning for the interview, I can try again to be at the interview on time, because that's a professional thing to do, right? You don't give a good impression if you're late for a job interview. But again, I said try. Why? Because we live in New York. I'm going to take the subway. But subways sometimes are delayed. There could be an accident on the line and everything stops. Or I can drive, but there's traffic, which I don't control. Even if I get out of the house with plenty of time, what I think is plenty of time, something might happen that actually precludes me getting there on time. So that's what Epictetus is saying. So he says, shifts your emphasis. Don't focus on the outcome, on, I want the job, because that's not up to you.
Yeah.
Focus on what you're doing to prepare for the best outcome. Of course, there is a causal connection between your preparation and the outcome, right? If you actually do study well, prepare well for the interview, if you do sleep in the night before, if you do get on time, if you keep focused during the interview, chances are you're actually going to get the job. But Epictetus says, so what if you don't? Right? You have to be able, remember the second part of the initial section of the Epictetus says, accept the outcomes with equanimity. So you tell yourself from the beginning, it's like, okay, there is a chance I'm not going to get the job. That's fine. I'll survive. I'm not going to die because of that. There will be other jobs. There will be other interviews. I can do other things that don't necessarily require me being hired in this situation. So I think you're right that the problem, or at least a major problem with people's unhappiness, is that we are raised by our parents and by society at large to focus on the outcomes.
Yeah, I think also, if I may refer to what you said before about positive psychology and all this this type of things, which is also on Instagram and everything. Everything you see is all positivity all the time, and I think most of it is focusing on outcomes. And would you say, first of all, yeah, the unhappiness part of it is pretty obvious when you explain it like that, but perhaps it's also making us weaker as a society.
Sure, because it makes us, it puts us in the thralls of outcomes that we don't control. Therefore, we're shattered, emotionally, or we think that it's a horrible thing because we didn't get the job, or it's a horrible thing because we don't have enough likes on, Facebook or whatever it is. So we become, yes, weak in a sense in terms of character, right? Not being able to withstand setbacks in life is a weakness because you're guaranteed to get setbacks. Even the most lucky person, right, that you can think of, somebody who is very healthy, smart, and successful, and that eventually that person will be faced with setbacks. Somebody who he loves is going to die.
Yeah.
Right. That happens. I mean, it will happen. It's guaranteed. It may not be tomorrow or the year after, but it will happen. And moreover, he is going to die at some point. He will have to face his own mortality. And that's, of course, according to the Stoics, certainly Seneca, for instance, that's the most important, most difficult test of our character. How are you going to face your own mortality when the time comes, right? So, yes, focusing too much on outcomes and therefore sort of falling to pieces when we don't get what we want, in a sense, it's really, as I was saying a few minutes ago, behaving like children.
Yeah.
And one of the problem with children is, of course, they are not at fault. It's a normal thing. But once you become an adult, that's the whole point, right? One of the things about becoming an adult is precisely that you don't react to things the way a child would.
Yeah, but do you think something has to do with the self-help industry, like all the books and all the even in social media and everything? I think that many of these things are trying to make you focus on outcomes. Everything is outcome celebrated, so perhaps it helps getting outcomes, but it is making the subject weaker.
Right. So yes, absolutely. I mean, I don't want to give the impression that outcomes are irrelevant.
Yeah.
I want that job. That's why I'm going for the interview, right? It's just that if I don't get it, it's not the end of the world. I'm not going to be shattered. I'm not going to fall to pieces.
Something that I discovered recently regarding football, European, North American, the actual, right? That the agents that are trying to evaluate the value of players, this is one of their main aspects of evaluating how they react to tense moments and setbacks.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's the same in any kind of job that requires, steel nerves. Like if you're, I don't know, a pilot, for instance, either a civilian or a military pilot, it's very important how you react in an emergency, right? If you just let it go and you say, "Oh my gosh, this is horrible," the plane is going down. You and other people are going to die, right? So exactly how we react under pressure is a really good mark of our character. And I'm not suggesting for a moment that it's easy, right? So again, I don't buy into the general idea of the self-help industry that, oh, if I just explain things to you, then that's easy. You're going to go and do it. No, it requires a lot of work, and you will fail because you're a human being, right? There will be situations where you will shatter, where you're going to be, you lose a loved one, for instance. It will happen. But the idea is that you realize that that's not the best response you can have to those kinds of trying situations, and you're going to work to make it better. But it's a constant amount of work. It never ends.
You mentioned Julius, and there's a famous saying that the flood is always upon us.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Right. And it is, right? Even, as I said, even in the best life you can imagine, things can easily turn all of a sudden in the wrong direction. And if you are going to fall apart for minor things, likes on Facebook. Then imagine what's going to happen if something really serious is going to picture.
You mentioned mortality and the way one is I don't know even how to say that, how it reflects on his life based on his own mortality is one of the most the best thing to evaluate character. I wanted to ask, first of all, you personally, how often do you meditate on your own mortality or death?
Fairly often. When I was younger, I wouldn't say obsessed, but I was thinking about mortality way too much in the wrong way. That is, like most people, afraid of dying. Right. Even though I was young and therefore, presumably, statistically speaking, death was not exactly around the corner. Still, the contemplating the notion of the annihilation of my consciousness is like, no, I don't like that. I still don't like it. It's not, don't get me wrong. It's not something I'm looking forward to. But I now developed over the years, in part thanks to Stoicism, a different approach. So what the Stoics do is they actually engage in a type of meditation on death. It's usually referred to as the Memento mori, which is Latin for remember you're mortal. There is an interesting story behind it. So the phrase comes from the fact that in ancient Rome, when a general or an emperor would win a big battle or war, they would be given the privilege of doing a triumph. So they would be able to go with their chariot and their soldiers and their captives and the stuff that they got from the war under a gigantic arch, surrounded by a lot of people that were all very happy to celebrate. So this was, of course, an important recognition, right, for either the general or the king. But they realized that there was a good chance that people egos would be overinflated, right? So I mean, imagine yourself, you're going through this procession, everybody's happy on you, and they think that you're the best thing that ever happened to Rome and all that. So that boosts your ego. So in order to counter that, the ritual was that the general or emperor was in his chariot, saluting the crowd and all that. But behind it, there was a guy who from time to time would whisper in his ear, Memento mori, remember you're mortal. Right? So don't get too excited about this. This is great. You did something good, and and people are recognizing. But remember, you are just as mortal as the other people. You're not a god. So that notion on Memento mori is being turned by the Stoics, especially the modern Stoics, into a series of meditations that you can engage in order to not only remind yourself that you're mortal, but to get used to the notion that death is just another aspect of life.
Before we get into them, what is the benefit of acknowledging your mortality?
So there are. So this comes from, interestingly, from modern psychotherapy. There is a modern version of psychotherapy that is called cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT.
Oh, yes.
Right. It's arguably the most evidence-based type of psychotherapy available today. Interestingly, it started out in the 1960s right here in New York with a guy named Albert Ellis. And Ellis actually was inspired directly by the Stoics. He had read Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, and said, these people were onto something here. And simultaneously, another researcher, Aaron Beck, also studied something very similar, and he also was inspired by the Stoics. And so you're asking, what is the benefit? So there are two ways to approach a potentially negative outcome. One is essentially the fragility path, the oh my gosh, this is going to happen, this is horrible. So it's a very emotional kind of path, like, oh, I don't want to die, I don't want to do this, this is horrible. That's not helpful, according either to Stoicism or to CBT. What you're doing there is you're making yourself vulnerable. You are going to be obsessing about it. You're going to develop anxiety about it, none of which is good. It may be natural, but that just because it's natural, that doesn't mean it's good. I mean, being anxious about one's own death probably is natural because the instinct for survival is a biological instinct, but it's not enough. This is not going to do anything other than causing you anxiety about something you cannot avoid anywhere. The other path is the cognitive path. That's why it's called cognitive behavioral therapy, right? So you think, you contemplate that particular thing you're afraid of, in this case, death, but you do so analytical, not emotion. So you use language. These exercises are often either written exercises or sort of mental meditation where you repeat to yourself certain things. You try to stay away from emotional language. You switch to analytical language. So you tell yourself, well, exactly what is this thing? What is it made of? What is its impact? So you're trying to analyze the thing. And often these exercises are carried out in the second person. So you don't say, I'm going to die. You say, you are going to die, as if you were talking to a friend. It turns out this is what the Stoics did. Marcus Aurelius, for instance, in his famous meditations, he speaks in the second person, which is weird. When you start reading it, it's like, wait a minute, who is he talking to? And it turns out, oh, he's talking to himself. Why the hell is he talking to himself in the second person? But modern CBT actually confirms, there's research that confirms that if you do that, those two things, you use analytic rather than emotional language, and you speak in the second or even third person, not in the first person, what you're doing is you're distancing yourself emotionally from whatever the thought, in this particular case, the thought of your demise. And that helps you cope with it. It's like you were writing or speaking to a friend. Like, okay, yeah, this is going to happen to you. But let's think about it. Let's consider it. Let's see what it is. Let's analyze it. Let's unpack it, and so on and so forth. So there's very good evidence that this kind of approach actually is very helpful. Now, I was going to say there are specific ways of doing this. My favorite Memento Mori exercise is to go and take a walk in a cemetery.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So I live in Brooklyn, near in New York, in Brooklyn Heights, which is right across from Manhattan, from Lower Manhattan. So I take the subway and I step out at Wall Street, and nearby there is a Trinity Church, which is a very famous old church. It has a lovely cemetery, which is interesting because it's surrounded by skyscrapers. So it's a really bizarre thing, right? It's a very serene spot surrounded by chaos and traffic and Wall Street and all that sort of stuff. In that cemetery, there was a lot of interesting people that were buried there, including Hamilton, for instance. And so what I do is I take my time. I take a walk. I look at several tombstones and inscriptions in them. I read the names. I read the dates when they were born or when they were dead. And then I remember myself. I tell myself, one of these days you're going to be on that sort of stuff.
And what's the benefits?
So the benefit is that it normalizes this thing. So instead of staying away and not thinking about it and, I want to avoid it, like there's nothing to avoid. You can't avoid it.
It's becoming friends with that.
Becomes friends. That's right.
Wow, that's fascinating.
And interestingly, one of these effects that this kind of exercise has is not only it makes you gradually more and more acquainted with the idea, and therefore you're accepted, you're less disturbed, you're not anxious about it, etc. But when you step outside of the cemetery, and in my case, you're now all of a sudden back in the middle of Lower Manhattan with people sending you hot dogs and pretzels and stuff like that, you appreciate the fact that you're alive much more. It's a reminder. It's like, okay, one of these days I'm going to be there, but right now, today, I'm not. This is not the day.
Yeah, it's a gratitude practice. It's about. You mentioned Epictetus, and this is fascinating. He has also the causes of emotional disturbance, which is something that helped me a lot. But one thing that comes to mind with everything that we are discussing about death is Ernst Becker and the denial of death, which he suggests perhaps that many people's lives are dedicated to just avoid the concept of your own demise by creating projects and stuff just to be remembered.
Right.
Do you think this is another thing that damages mental health?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I'm not sure about damaging mental health, but it is a type of avoidance, to be sure. I mean, we seem to have an instinct of wanting to be remembered, right? So this is probably, as a biologist, I would guess, it's only a guess, but I would guess that it's an extension of our instinct to procreate. Right? So the way we're immortal, so to speak, from a biological perspective is because we pass our genes to our offspring.
Yeah, legacy.
Yes, yeah, it's an immediate biological legacy, and of course we've done it since time immemorial. All my ancestors have done it, otherwise I wouldn't be here. Right? But I think that in a cultural setting, in a modern cultural setting, and by modern I mean the last 2 or 3,000 years, that is not the Pleistocene, not during very early period of human history. I think we started adding layers to that conception of legacy. It's not just genetic anymore. Some of us decide not to have children, for instance. Right? It's what we do. We remember because we build cathedrals, because we write books, because we do music, because we do all sorts of things that we hope next generations, new generations are going to appreciate. They remember us. And that's fine. I don't think there's a problem with that. That's an impetus to human creativity. It's a good thing. However, if you take that as a way to not think about death, I think that's problematic. You should do whatever it is, write books, build cathedrals, anything that you think is good for humanity and that might, in fact, give you a legacy of a few generations or maybe a little bit more. But as Marcus Aurelius says, eventually you're going to be forgotten. If enough time passes, your cathedrals are going to crumble. Your books are not going to be read anymore. Your music is going to be outdated, and so on and so forth. So eventually you will be forgotten. And therefore, this is not really a solution to the problem. There is no solution to the problem. People often just don't want to hear that. A lot of Stoicism, and not just Stoicism, other philosophies of life, for instance, Buddhism, would insist that the fact that you think there is a problem and therefore you assume there is a solution to that problem, that's childish again. It's not going to happen. There are some problems for which there is no solution. Death is one of them, right? Yes, I know that there is a lot of people these days who dream of immortality, by uploading their consciousness to computers. I think that's a lot of nonsense, quite frankly. I don't think that's the way consciousness works. And of course, those people are not a new thing. People have been going after the fountain of youth from time immemorial. This is not a novel thing. This is not some modern fashion. This is going back thousands of years. But I think a mark on maturity, again, is the realization that some problems cannot be solved. Either in general, I think death is one of those that cannot be solved, period. In fact, it's not even a problem. It's a natural process. It's part of the natural process of living. It's not a problem. It becomes a problem only if your ego is large enough that it tells you that you ought to live forever. Nobody ought to live forever, because otherwise there would be no space for new generations, right? And here we are here because other people died and made space for us to come into the world. So it's really a question of misguided ego. There are also some relatively minor problems, local problems that cannot be solved by you. Somebody else might be able to solve it, right? But you may not be able to. And that's just part of life. Life poses to setbacks, issues, problems. Sometimes you overcome those and sometimes you don't. And I think a fundamental aspect of wisdom is, as the Serenity Prayer says, to be able to tell the difference between what you can do and what you cannot do. Have the courage to do what you can, but also have the serenity to accept that you cannot.
That's fascinating. And going back to Marcus Aurelius in regards to death and mortality and the issue of legacy, I'm correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe he buried 6 of his children before he got an heir.
Yeah.
And which is, I think, is one of the biggest tests of character that someone can have. What's the biggest lesson that we can learn from Marcus Aurelius?
Oh, that's a good question. There are a number of lessons. One I think of the take home messages, so to speak, of meditations is that even though Marcus was an emperor, which at that time meant literally the most powerful man in the world, at least in the Mediterranean world, right? He had access to all of the resources in the Roman Empire. So he had wealth, he had the best physician of antiquity, Galen, he had a royal family, and so on. Even so, his life was a series of setbacks. Okay, so just to mention just a few, he had to deal with a devastating flood that destroyed half of Rome, earthquakes that demolished a number of cities in what is today Western Turkey, particularly Izmir, which was a major Roman city. Two frontier wars, one against the Parthians on the east and one against some Germanic tribes on the north. He had a rebellion to deal with, and one of his officers rebelled and tried to set himself up as emperor, and his wife was unfaithful. Oh, and there was a plague,
Yeah.
which killed, arguably, was the so-called Antonine plague, named after that particular group of emperors, the Antonines. Was arguably the worst plague of antiquity. It killed between 3 and 5 million people within the Roman Empire. So this was not an easy life, right? So here we have somebody who is as powerful and has access to as many resources as you can possibly think. Nobody can do it better, and yet he had a really difficult life. The notion that we can, what we can learn from that is, first of all, that nothing is going to shield you from setbacks. It doesn't matter. Even if you're the richest and most powerful person in the world, you will face setbacks. That's just the way life works. And the other thing is, how did he deal with? He did it with a lot of equanimity and with a lot of wisdom. He was always moderate in his reactions. Even though his wife was unfaithful, he was faithful. He still cherished her. He did his best to channel resources in order to rebuild Rome and Izmir because of the flood and earthquakes. He did his best to deal with the pandemic. Of course, at the time, it was very difficult because they had no idea what kind of things was causing that sort of plague. He did his best with the two wars. He did not, it was constantly trying to come up with diplomatic solutions, reducing, violence as much as possible, with minimizing the use of violence and so on and so forth. So that, I think, is the most important thing to learn from Marcus Aurelius. On the one hand, that no matter how powerful and lucky, in a sense, you are in the world, you will face sometimes even major setbacks or problems. And on the other hand, the fact that you can do it with equanimity and wisdom.
Yeah, I think one of the other things that astonished me about him was the fact that he is only one of few good emperors, quote unquote.
Yeah.
It was very appealing to become bad.
Yes.
So being good in a sense, I don't know even what's the better word for it, was not an easy choice, but he chose it.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, what we say today, power corrupts and absolute power
Yeah.
corrupts absolutely. Well, he had absolute power.
Yeah.
Like the emperors had absolute powers. And you're right, the record is not good. Many of the emperors were either mediocre or really downright bad. Some of them were certifiable psychopaths. Yes. A few, however, were able to do things with wisdom, with compassion, etc. Marcus was definitely one of those few. So that's a tribute to his character.
Yeah. What else about meditations you think is the best thing that one can get from this book to improve his mental health? And
Well, there are a lot of exercises, so-called spiritual exercises that Marcus details in the meditations, and they're all very useful. The Stoics in general, one of the reasons Stoicism probably is so popular is because it comes with a lot of practices. It's not just something that you read and think about. They actually tell you, okay, here's what you're going to do. It's like going to the gym, right? You don't go to the gym, again, to make the analogy with physical fitness. You don't go to the gym and just look around at the machines and the weights and then say, well, I'm done. You have to use them. If you don't use them, it's not gonna do you any good. So Stoicism does have that characteristic, and all of the major Stoics really have in their writings, they do present a number of what we today call mental or spiritual exercises. Seneca does it, Epictetus does it, Marcus does it. But in the meditations, you really find a lot of these things. For instance, one of my favorite is, other than the Memento mori, of course, that we just mentioned, one of my favorite is the sunrise meditation, which Marcus describes in the Meditations. He actually tells us that it predates the Stoics. It's something that the Pythagoreans, the followers of Pythagoras, were doing, 2 or 3 centuries before Stoicism was even born. And the sunrise meditation is very simple. I mean, it is what it sounds like. You get up in the morning before sunrise. You pick a spot from where you can see the sun rising above the horizon, and you just wake and then look at it, not directly. Was you're going to get blind. Now, why would you want to do that? It's a way to reconnect with nature. The Stoics were big about nature. They thought that we should live according to nature. In fact, that was the motto of the school, was to live according to nature. By which they meant we need to recognize that we have a nature as living organisms. There's such a thing as human nature, and that tells you a lot. If you understand what human nature is, that will tell you a lot about what makes you happy, because what makes you happy is not the same thing that makes a cat happy, or a dog, or a horse, or whatever it is. But they also talked about cosmic nature. They thought that we are part and parcel of the universe. We're connected with the rest of the universe. Everything is, in fact, interconnected, according to the Stoics, which is a very modern notion in terms of ecology, for instance. We truly are interconnected with the environment and with other species. And so doing the sunrise meditation is a way to remind yourself of that connection. Because too often we just get up in the morning and we get down to whatever work we have to do, and then the day passes, and then you get to dinner time, and then you're tired, and you go to bed. And so there's no time for a broader view of things, to step back for a moment and remind yourself that there is actually a broader universe out there of which you are a part. So to purposefully engage in that kind of meditation, obviously not every day, to do it once a week, once a month, it doesn't really matter. And it's not the only way to reconnect. I mean, you can do a sunrise meditation, reconnect with nature. You can do a sunrise meditation. You can go for a hike. You can watch a nature documentary, whatever it works for you. Although actual nature is better than just watching something about nature, I would argue. So that's one of the things that you learn from the meditations. There are a number of other exercises. Another one, for instance, which comes up several times in the meditations, it's called, in modern terminology, it's called the view from above. What Marcus tries to do repeatedly is to take a broader perspective on things, reminding himself that whatever trouble he was having in that particular moment, that particular day, sure, it was important, it had to be dealt with, but in the general scheme of things, it wasn't really that important. And that kind of helps. This is something that modern psychologists also tell you to do. It's like, take a distance from your immediate problems, because that will put things into perspective. Marcus does this in 2 ways. He does it either temporally, he takes a temporal perspective, or a spatial one. So temporally, he says to himself, it's like, okay, remember, you are focused on this particular problem, but generations of people before you had the same problem or similar ones, and generations of people after you will have the same problem. So it's a way to sort of step back in terms of temporal sequence, and remind yourself that you're just one moment in time, but time itself goes on for incredible spans, both before and after you. The other way to do the same exercise is spatially. So it reminds himself, it's like, remember, you're just a tiny little speck of dust on a tiny little planet, but there is a cosmos out there. right? There are other planets, there are stars, there's all sorts of other things that, and that again, it's a way to step back at a spatial level and remind yourself that, yeah, this particular problem seems really crucial, important, difficult, whatever it is, momentous, or whatever it is. But if you were seeing it from the point of view of the moon, event, which is the closest planet to us, it would look insignificant. Yeah, so this general notion of putting things in perspective is very helpful, and you do find it in Marcus many times. One of the things about meditations that people, I think, need to understand, because otherwise you might be disappointed when you read the book. First of all, it's not a book that you read cover to cover, because there's no argument in there, there's no sequence in there.
Not.
It's not, yeah, it's not meant to teach you, let's say, about Stoicism or philosophy in general. This is not a book that he wrote for other people. This was his personal philosophical journal.
Did it not meant for it to be even published?
Yeah, it didn't mean to be published. So in fact, he would be surprised. He says several times, remember, you're in a few generations, people are going to be forgetting you. And so he would be surprised that 2,000 years later, we still remember him and talk about it. So it was not meant for publication. There's no structure to it. Okay. Book 1 or book 2 or book 3 or book 4, it doesn't matter. You can read it in whatever, by book, I mean chapters. They're called books traditionally, but they're actually chapters. You can read it in whatever sequence. And in fact, you don't even need to read necessarily an entire chapter at a time. Just open it at random and you look at a few paragraphs. It's repetitive. You will notice that it goes back to the same topic over and over. Now, that's usually not something that we value in a book, right? You'd be repetitive. But it's understandable in a journal, because he was going back to, let's say, anger, for instance, as a problem, because he had an anger management issue and he was aware of it. And so he goes back to it as like, well, you did it again, or you got close to being angry again. So what's the matter with you? That sort of stuff. And it's also a little bit preaching, the Meditations. It feels like he's preaching to somebody, especially because he uses this trip that I mentioned earlier, probably in the second person. From the point of view of the reader, it looks like he's talking to me, right? You're reading, and you're reading Marcus, and he says, well, you need to do this or that or the other. So I was like, wait a minute, is he talking to me? No, he's talking to himself. And the fact that he's preachy, it's because he wants to repeat to himself over and over certain things and spur himself to do better the next time. So once you understand what the Meditations actually is, how and why it was written, then it's a completely different kind of reading.
Yeah, that's fascinating as well. The thing you mentioned that I want to dive into is the notion of ego. A famous quote from Stoicism is, "Ego is the enemy." And what does the public don't understand about it in your?
Yeah, so the specific phrase is from a modern Stoic author, Ryan Holiday.
Oh yeah,
It's not actually found directly in the Stoic.
oh, I thought it was.
But the concept is the notion is there. So one of the differences, let's talk about ego a little bit. So one of the differences between Stoicism and Buddhism, the two philosophies are often compared, because there are actually a lot of similarities, especially when it comes to the ethics, that is, when it comes to what to do. The metaphysics behind those philosophies is actually very different. Like, for instance, the Buddhists believe in things like reincarnation, karma, stuff like that. The Stoics don't. The Stoics are materialists. They think that everything is made of matter, and matter dies in the case. And that's it. There's not going to be any reincarnation. There's not going to be any accounting, cosmic accounting of what you do and what you don't do. So they're very different in metaphysics. But from an ethical perspective, they're actually very similar. They recommend essentially very close to the same kind of life. Even so, there are some important differences, and one of those differences is about ego. So the Buddhists think the ego is the fundamental, what they call the rapacious ego, is the fundamental problem, the fundamental cause of suffering. It's because we get too attached, our ego gets too attached to all sorts of things, including people, possessions, and so on and so forth. And that is the source of suffering. Now, the Stoics agree that over attachment is problematic, but they don't cancel detachment, which the Buddhists do. What the Stoics say is like, just take things lightly. Right? Epictetus has this wonderful metaphor. For instance, it says you should go through life as if you were checking into an inn, into a hotel. You check into the hotel, and your room is your room. Okay? Nobody else is coming in to take over or sleep in your bed or something like that. That is your bed. It's your lamp. It's your desk, etc. But not really. You're just borrowing them for the time that you are there. But at some point, you'll check out. In other words, you die. And when you do that, you should be making sure that you're leaving those things in good shape, because somebody else is coming back and use them, right? So you should regard everything, even so-called possessions, not as really yours, he says, but as if you borrowed them from the universe, and realize that the universe can take them back at any moment. In other words, you can die at any moment, or you can lose things like wealth or relationships and so on at any moment, and you need to be prepared for that. I think it's a very wise and very beautiful way of looking at things, and it conveys this notion that you need to tread lightly on in the world, or not leave too much of a footprint, because that's problematic for other people. So now one of the let's go back to the ego notion. So therefore, while the Buddhists are trying to minimize or even get rid of the ego, right? The famous no self notion that Buddhists have is an attempt to say, look, this is not really who you are, and it's an illusion in a sense, and you need to get rid of it because it causes suffering both for you and for others. The Stoics disagree. They think that we are our ego, we are ourselves. There is a self, and that's who we are. In fact, Epictetus says, who you really are is not your limbs or your body parts or whatever. Is a small part of your faculty, your mental faculty. Only one faculty. It's really important. It's the faculty that he calls prohairesis, which is often translated with will, or the faculty of judgment.
For the listener, you pointed at your
I'm pointing here because although the Stoics were wrong actually about where the prohairesis is located, they thought it was in the heart, right?
And you between.
But I was pointing here because it turns out that one can make an argument that prohairesis, the faculty of the will, is really what modern cognitive scientists call the executive function of the brain. And the executive function of the brain is the frontoparietal lobes. So it's the frontal cortex. It's anatomically well determined that that's where it happens. Your
thinking brain.
Yes, the thinking brain. Your decision making gets seriously impaired if you have damage, either from disease or accident, to the frontoparietal lobes. So I think it's a reasonable extrapolation to say that the prohairesis of Epictetus is somewhere in the frontal lobes of your brain. He thinks that that's who you really are. Everything else is accidental. Everything else, first of all, is not under your control. Whether you are handsome or not, it's not under your control. Whether you do have a normal limbs, or you lost one for some reason, disease or accident or war at the time, that's not up to you. And it doesn't change who you are, most important thing. Whether you have both arms or only one, well, you're the same person. It's obviously inconvenient. There's no question about it. It's better to have two arms than one. But it doesn't change who you really are. And again, there is some pretty good evidence from modern cognitive science that he was right. There are, broadly speaking, there are two classes of cognitive degenerative diseases, like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, things like that. But there are two broad classes. One changes people's memories, affects mostly memory. The other one changes people's personality, but not the matter. Okay? So one is memory, not personality. The other one is personality, not memory. And if you ask the loved ones, the relatives, the friends, of people who are affected in these two groups, they will say that if somebody loses their memory, it's tragic, it's clearly disconcerting, but they can tell it's the same person. Yeah, this is my grandmother. She acts and reacts and talks, and my grandmother always has. Yeah, she doesn't remember what happened yesterday. She doesn't remember what happened, sometimes maybe she doesn't even recognize me, and that's disturbing. But she is the same person that I've known for a while. The second group of patients, the ones that are affecting their personality on the other hand, it's much harder on the family and on their friends because they don't recognize them.
Yeah.
They think this is a different person. It has the memories. So, my grandmother remembers things and even recognizes me, but she reacts in a way and she talks in a way that is not what my grandmother used to do because her personality has changed.
Can you give just the actual diseases that's so we can understand?
So the Alzheimer's tend to affect memory, and so, but I don't have an example right now of a disease of the second kind. I would need to look it up, but it is well known that these two broad categories. Of course, things are complicated in terms of neuroscience, right? So there are situations that are more complicated than where there are aspects of both. But broadly speaking, those are the two major categories. So Epictetus would say, right, that's proof that the proairesis is who you really are. If you start talking in a different way, making decisions differently, your values are different from what they were. You are not yourself anymore. If you just lost your memory, you're still yourself. So the most precious thing that we have, according to the Stoics, is the self, understood in that way.
Yeah, which comes back to ego, which you say
Yes.
is interconnected.
They're interconnected. So the notion in Stoicism, therefore, is that the self exists and it's important. In fact, is who you are. The ego is a self that tends to overextend, to take over,
Yes.
have the wrong priorities in a sense, right?
Yeah. Epictetus was a slave.
He started his life as a slave. That's right. He was, in fact, his name Epictetus just means acquired. We don't know his real name. Acquired refers to the fact that he was a slave. He grew up in Hierapolis, which is in modern Western Turkey, and that he was bought by Epaphroditus, who was Nero's personal secretary, and brought to Rome to the court of Nero, where incidentally also Seneca was, because Seneca was Nero's advisor. So they probably met, although Epictetus was much younger than Seneca. And there is no reference by either one about the other. Seneca doesn't mention Epictetus, probably because he was just a kid. Epictetus doesn't mention Seneca, and that's more interesting because, he must have been aware that Seneca was there. He probably disagreed politically with Seneca. He thought that Seneca was a little too friendly with Nero, or enabled the Nero regime.
Nero was one of the bad ones.
Nero was definitely one with bad hands. And so it was a narcissistic psychopath,
Wow.
essentially. So yes, Epictetus was brought to Rome as a slave, but then it wasn't unusual for slaves that were particularly smart, and especially that had a certain degree of, that were given duties that were not just the menial tasks of cleaning up stuff or things like that, but they were given some kind of intellectual duties, such as writing down things or checking the correspondence of their master, whatever it is. It was not unusual for those slaves at some point to be manumitted, meaning given their freedom. And so at one point, Epaphroditus, probably after Nero dies, gives Epictetus his freedom, and Epictetus stays in Rome for a while and starts teaching. He goes around. He's essentially a street preacher. Yeah. Just goes into the streets and talks to people about Stoicism. He had been able to, Epaphroditus had allowed him to study with a guy named Musonius Rufus, who was one of the major Stoic features in Rome at the time. And in fact, we have some lectures that are surviving by Musonius, and you can see the influence of Musonius on Epictetus, because some of the things that Epictetus says in the discourses clearly come from his master, from his teacher. Now, not his master as in a slave, but as from his teacher. So Epictetus does this, and he tells the story in the discourses. He says that didn't go very well because at some point somebody came up to me and he was really upset about what I was saying, just punched me on the nose. And he said, at that point, I realized that I probably would be better off not teaching in the streets, but actually establishing my own school so that people would come to me if they wanted to, rather than I going out there and bothering people. So he does.
Preaching is not a very effective.
No, that's right. It can be dangerous.
Yeah.
People get upset. So he does establish his school in Rome. Eventually, however, both Epictetus and a number of other people, including his teacher Musonius, get on the nerves of a later emperor, Domitian, who was another psychopath, incidentally. And why did they do so? Because the Stoics had this tendency to, as we would say today, speak truth to power. And power usually doesn't like truth to be told. Therefore, Domitian sort of tolerated this thing for a while, and then at some point he just lost it, and he killed a number of Stoic practitioners, and then he sent a bunch of them into exile. So Epictetus is sent into exile. He's sent to northwestern Greece, a place called Nicopolis, which still exists today. I actually visited a few years ago. It's a coastal town on the northwestern part of Greece. And there's still Roman ruins there, so you can walk in there and imagine that Epictetus went to the same theater, that is still part of the theater that is intact. Epictetus rebuilt his school there, and eventually became so successful that later emperors like Hadrian, who was one of the good emperors, actually came to visit and pay respect to Epictetus. Epictetus lived into his 90s apparently. And he became essentially the most, or at least one of the most respected and sought after teachers of antiquity.
Yeah, this is impressive.
It's an incredible story.
Yeah,
Sorry.
it's an incredible story. Many of the great Stoics had incredible stories like that.
Yes, we talked about Marcus. We talked about Epictetus. I guess we should talk about Seneca, the third big Roman Stoic, from whom, in fact, Seneca is the Stoic from whom we have by far the largest extant writings. So more than half of all the Stoic writings we had comes from Seneca. So Seneca is an important figure. And yeah, he had an interesting life as well. He was a member, he was an aristocrat, he was a member of a patrician family. He was at the court of the Emperor Claudius. He gets accused of having an affair with the sister of a previous emperor, Caligula, another nutcase. Caligula is the one that made one of his horses senator, for instance.
Oh.
Among many other things, the stories that one can tell about Caligula. So Claudius condemned Seneca to death as a result. Apparently, it's very likely that Seneca did not, in fact, have an affair with Caligula's sister. This was a political ploy by Claudius's wife to get rid of Seneca because she didn't like him from a political perspective. Claudius, however, commutes the sentence from death to exile, so Seneca is sent to Corsica, to the island of Corsica. Now, today, and he stays there several years. Now, today, if you go to Corsica, it's a beautiful island. It's a resort island in the middle of the Mediterranean. You say, well, if only I could be sent to exile to Corsica. But at the time, it was a little bit more of a ragged place 2,000 years ago. It wasn't exactly, hotel resorts and stuff like that.
It's the birthplace of Napoleon.
Yes, that's right. It's the birthplace of Napoleon. And so he stays there until he's recalled back to Rome, because in the meantime, Claudius has gotten rid of his previous wife, and he has married Agrippina. Agrippina is the mother of Nero, of the young leader. So Agrippina lobbies Claudius to recall Seneca to court because she wants him to become the tutor of Nero, which he does. And then Claudius dies, Nero becomes emperor. And so he's, I think, 17 at that point. And Seneca takes over the role of advisor to the emperor. Now, I mentioned a minute ago that Epictetus probably didn't like this thing. And in fact, even a lot of modern commentators say, oh, Seneca's legacy is tainted because he was involved with the Nero regime, etc. But things are actually a little bit more complicated than that, as often is the case. For one thing, because actually Nero at that time seemed to still be a somewhat reasonable person. He degenerated over time. Over the years, he got worse and worse. So initially, when he was 17, you couldn't really tell that this was going to become a psychopath. So Seneca is not at fault there for taking over the job. Not only that, but for the first 5 years of Nero's reign, things went very well. And most of that was because Seneca was guiding Nero. Seneca and another guy who was the chief guide of the Praetorian Guard. The Praetorian Guard was the personal guard of the emperor. So the two of them worked together in order to sort of steer Nero in the right direction. And apparently they were very successful. Scholars today refer to that period as the Neronian quinquennium, which, the 5 years of Nero, during which actually Rome was doing very well. So Seneca was effective. What happened then is that the Seneca's friend, the head of the Praetorian Guard, died. And in the meantime, Nero was asserting himself more and more, and he was going more and more into the psychopathology and narcissistic behavior for which then became famous. At that point, Seneca initially tried to keep steering things and then realized that he couldn't do it, and he tried to retire. So to his credit, he saw at some point that Nero was going in the wrong direction, and he said, okay, I don't want anything to do with this. But Nero did not let him retire because he needed the official endorsement of somebody with the prestige of Seneca.
Oh, not even the wisdom itself.
No, not the wisdom, the prestige. So to prop up the regime, because then, make it look like the things were still going well. So Seneca tries multiple times to retire. He actually bribes the emperor. He says, look, you can take all my money. I don't care. Just leave me one property outside of Rome and I'll be there. But Nero doesn't agree. At some point, a conspiracy against Nero is discovered. And Nero thinks that Seneca is involved in the conspiracy. So he essentially orders him to commit suicide. Which he does, which Seneca does. It was 69, the same age of Socrates when he died. Now, interestingly, historians have been asking, well, did Seneca actually know, about the conspiracy? Was he a part of the conspiracy? And the best guess that we have is that Seneca was not a direct participant. In other words, he wasn't holding a dagger ready to stab the emperor, but he knew about it and didn't say anything to the emperor, which for all effective purposes is the same as being part of the conspiracy.
Yeah.
So once you put all those things together, it becomes a little more difficult to say that Seneca was a complicit in the regime. It was there, and he was trying to do his best under very difficult circumstances. So I'm not as harsh on Seneca as other people are. In fact, another piece of evidence is an essay that Seneca wrote right when Nero became emperor. So he dedicates it to Nero, to the young Nero. And the essay is called On Clemency. And in it, Seneca does something interesting. So the typical reading of On Clemency is that this is just a book that he dedicates to the young emperor in order to, to obtain favors and, to be on the good side of the emperor. So in other words, it's yet more proof that Seneca was really not a particularly wise or good person. But if you actually read it, there are several places in On Clemency where Seneca threatens Nero. He says, you're great, you're going to be doing great things, remember, you're going to be remembered as a great emperor. But remember, if you don't, your predecessors, some of your predecessors who misbehaved, who did not do the right thing, who didn't treat the Roman people in the right way, they were killed.
Yeah.
He does that multiple times. So this is somebody who is actually threatening the future emperor. This is not exactly somebody who was just trying to curry favor with the new kid on the block. So it's more complicated.
Yeah, well, this is the Seneca is a wonderful story about power and the way it needs to be treated.
Yes.
And it gets us back to the self-help, modern self-help, and things that we can do or hear about from you. I want to go back to mental toughness and mental strength. And what do you think is the biggest thing that we can do as a society, as individuals, to improve our mental strength?
Yeah, that's a good question. Epictetus says that explicitly several times in the discourses. He says to his students, "You guys just need to pay attention." He uses a word prosoke, which in ancient Greek means attention. It just means paying attention. Sometimes it's translated as mindfulness, and so people speak of Stoic mindfulness, but that's because mindfulness is very popular these days, and so a lot of people want to use that kind of vocabulary. The actual meaning of the term is just attention. But Epictetus and in Seneca repeatedly say nothing is improved by not paying attention to things. If you do something and you're not paying attention, your attention wanders around and you're distracted by other things, you're not going anywhere. And we live in a society where attention is a big problem. I see it with my own students, right? So I go into the classroom and I start my lecture, and then half of them are on cell phones or laptops or tablets. And I guarantee you they're not taking notes. It's of course. That is a problem because a lot of people today think that they can multitask, right? So, but in fact, modern psychology, modern cognitive science tells you there is no such thing as multitasking.
Just one clarification: there's a myth, perhaps, about the difference between men and women in this regard.
Yes,
women can multitask,
right,
and men don't.
But in fact, nobody can.
No,
as it turns out, the human brain is just not built for multitasking. What we know from modern cognitive science is that the brain can pay attention to one thing at a time. When people say, "Oh, I can multitask," what they really mean is that they're switching attention constantly back and forth between 2 or 3 or 4 different things, right? So my students, for instance, tell me, "Oh, no, I can do it. I'm fine. I am listening to you. I'm taking notes. I'm watching, Facebook or TikTok or whatever it is."
And I can concentrate, perhaps. Yeah.
The problem is, yes, you can do all of that. But the way to do that is not because you are actually doing all of that simultaneously. You're paying a few seconds of attention to me, a few seconds to TikTok, a few seconds to your text messages or whatever it is. While you're paying attention to text messages, you're not watching TikTok and you're not listening to me, which means you're losing about a third of what's going on by the end of the lecture, okay? If you're doing 3 things. If you're doing 2 things, you're losing about half, or depending on how much time you switch between tasks. So there is no such thing as multitasking. And in fact, the modern technology, especially social media, is geared toward getting our attention.
Yes.
That's what it is.
Some people say that attention is the new oil.
Yes, exactly. Because it brings advertisers. Yeah. Essentially. That's what it is. So I would say that one of the best things you can do is to just shut out entirely with social media. A few years ago, I decided that social media was a failed experiment. That's it. We're done. And I'm not on any social media at all. I'm not on Facebook or Twitter. None of that stuff. And my life is so much better for it. It's unfortunate because the technology itself had the potential to be beneficial because when I was unfat on Facebook, for instance, I could keep in touch with easily with people that I know or family members. I have family members in Italy, and it's not that easy to communicate with people on the other side of the world, but it was easier to do it that way. When I was on what at the time was called Twitter, I was keeping nice conversations going with many of my followers, and people who were interested in my writings and so on. So there are positive things. Unfortunately, the more time passed, the more social media companies changed their tactics and changed even the way they engineer their platforms. So it's now all about outrage and attention grabbing and stuff like that.
This is fascinating, first of all, but this is I just need the clarification from you about the connection to mental toughness. Do you think do you say that this multitasking and the lack of attention is making us weaker?
That's right. Because mental toughness, one major component of mental toughness is the fact that you focus on task until you actually achieve it.
Oh,
Okay. So what makes you tough is that you don't give up easily. You don't get distracted. You are focused, laser focused, as they say, on that particular task until it's done. If you start getting distracted because your attention starts wandering all over the place, I mean, that is one of the reasons the Buddhists do meditations, right? To help their minds clear up all the garbage that comes up not naturally, that sort of floats your way in your mind so that you can actually get on with the business and what's important. If you don't, then that undermines your ability to be quote unquote mentally tough. The word tough is a little misleading because it's, of course, an analogy with physical strength. It's not quite the same. It's really, I wouldn't talk about toughness. I would call it the ability to be focused,
oh, really?
right? To pay attention to things.
I never thought about the interconnection of those two things. It's fascinating, but the thing I don't know if you know or perhaps you do. There is a Uberman, the Uberman Lab podcast. You are aware of it. He taught something that uh, transformed my life in one way, which is there is a part of the brain which benefits from doing hard things. It helps you do even harder things as a result, just like a muscle gets hypertrophy.
That's right.
If you do hard things, you can do even harder things as a
Absolutely.
result. Yeah. So would you say that this is something that Stoics would suggest? Take hard tasks and responsibilities.
Yes. Now, of course, they didn't know about modern research in cognitive science, so we need to be careful not to impute too much to the Stoics because, they lived 2,000 years ago, and so there's limitations. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, that is why Epictetus often uses the analogy with going to the gym. He says you need to get tough, in a sense, just in the way in which you do it at the gym. Now, how do you do it at the gym? By paying attention, by doing the same thing over and over, and by challenging yourself, right? So if you go to the gym, for instance, and I don't know, you have a set of exercises that have to do with upper body strength, right? You might start with a particular set of weights, particular block, because that's what's good for you at that home. But then if you stay there forever, you're not going to improve. Right? You reach a plateau and you're going to stay there. In fact, you might even get worse over time. That's why any good trainer will tell you you need to push yourself a little bit, not too much. Otherwise, you're going to strain yourself. You're going to cause an injury, right? And so there, you have to hit that sweet spot between things not being too easy and things not being too hard. There is a modern concept in psychology that really captured this thing. It's the notion of flow. Some psychologists have identified a number of years ago these particular mental state, which they refer to as flow, which happens when you're doing things that really absorb you, and you're enjoying what you're doing, and you lose track of time. So when you are in the flow zone, it's something that is enjoyable, very productive. You're doing something that is challenging, and you are so focused on it that you're not paying attention to anything else, including time. Well, people have done a lot of studies to say, to try to determine what causes the flow experience. Probably everybody has had it at one point or another. I've had it number of times. When I write, sometimes I get into the flow uh, zone, so to speak. But people have, psychologists are trying to figure out, okay, so how do you get there? And they realize that one major determinants of a state of flow is exactly what we're talking about. You don't want to engage in something that's too easy because you get bored, and that does not, it's not conducive to flow. But you also don't want to do something that's too challenging, too difficult, because then you get frustrated because you start failing. And that also gets you out of the zone flow. So the flow happens when you strike that nice balance between something that it's not easy, but it's also not too difficult. And of course, that balance changes over time.
Yeah.
Because you get better and better at certain things. Imagine, for instance, flow often is observed in people who play musical instruments or do some kind of physical activity. It's not just a mental thing. It doesn't happen only with mental activities like writing, for instance. Now, so imagine musician, right? Again, it's the same idea. The musician makes progress by challenging him or herself to do better little by little. If you give somebody who's, let's say, learning to play the saxophone, something that is an exercise that are too easy, they get bored. But if you give them something that is too difficult, they get frustrated and they're just going to say, whatever, forget it. I'm not good at this thing. That's what a good teacher will do. We will calibrate the exercises for that zone where people are challenged but not frustrated.
Yeah, that's amazing. I want to dive into, you talked just now about psychologists are referring to flow as something positive, but we started our conversation with mentioning that the modern psychology and especially the positive aspect of it, the positive psychology, is somewhat damaging. And what do you think is the thing with psychology treatment that is, it feels to me like an epidemic?
Yeah. So there are a number of issues there. First of all, I think that the idea of positive psychology is positive psychology is the right one. That is, that psychologists shouldn't spend all their times only working on pathological situations. They should also work on normal human being, normal range of human behavior that are not pathologies, and nevertheless are problematic because we said before, a lot of people seem to be unhappy. That's not a pathology, but it is something that you would think you want to work on. So I don't think the idea as such is not bad. However, I think that a lot of the problems come out actually of psychotherapy,
Yeah.
with one exception that I'll get to in a moment. So the classic approach to psychotherapy, Freud, Jung, and so on and so forth. First of all, it's based on shaky science. And modern science actually tells you there is no such thing as the ego and the superego and all that sort of stuff. There are no you know constructs, mental constructs such as the ones that are hypothesized either by Freud or by Jung. So that's already a bad beginning, because if it turns out that your psychotherapy is based on notions that don't actually have uh, any kind of base in science, that's a problem. But moreover, what happens is that these kinds of therapies go on for a lifetime, right? The classic Woody Allen psychotherapy method, right? So you keep going to the psychotherapist every week, sometimes multiple times a week for basically for years. If
Yeah,
not even
like a car payment,
Yeah.
yeah.
That is no good, because that means you're not making progress. You're not, so it becomes a crutch, not an actual solution to anything. There is an exception, and that is cognitive behavioral therapy. Cognitive behavioral therapy is a type of psychotherapy. As I said before, it's actually inspired at least by Stoic ideas, but it's supposed to be short term. You don't go to a CBT practitioner for years. If you do that, that's a bad CBT practitioner. A typical CBT practitioner will tell you that you're going to work on your whatever the problem is for a few weeks, maybe a few months, but that's it. You don't even get to a year, because either you can solve the problem, you're making progress, or you don't. And if you don't, then it turns out this approach is not good for you. You need to try something else. Yeah. Right. Now, I think that's a great way of doing things. The limitation of that approach is that it's not a comprehensive philosophy of life. It's a specific type of therapy aimed at specific issues. So you go, for instance, to a CBT practitioner because you suffer from anxiety of a particular type. You're anxious about what happened, death, or there's some strange kinds of anxieties, like the people who have had phobias. They're afraid of buttons, for instance, things like that, which like there's no reason for it. Yeah, but some people are. Now that is a problem that is tailor-made for CBT. The practitioner focuses on that particular problem, gives you exercises to do it. You do homework when you go to CBT practice, and then they monitors whether you're getting better or not. And if not, they may change approach, or they may tell you, look, you need something completely different. But that's not a philosophy of life. Philosophy of life is a comprehensive look at the world where you decide what is important, what is not important, what makes you happy, what doesn't make you happy. A psychotherapist cannot tell you that. Psychotherapists can focus on particular issues and trying to resolve or at least improve those issues, such as phobias, anxieties, depression, and that sort of stuff. But it cannot really articulate, CBT is not a way of life. Yeah. It's something you do, just like your doctor, in a sense, right? So you go to the doctor, for instance, a cardiologist, because you have a heart problem or something about your circulation is not right. But you're not going to go to the doctor and say, so what is a healthy life? Yeah. Right. Now, the general practitioner, who still is a doctor, might be able to sort of tell you more generally what a healthy life looks like. But even that is pretty limited. It tends to be linear, and they will say something genetic like healthy food and exercise, something like that. But it doesn't give you anything more specific than that. A philosophy of life, on the other hand, is pretty specific in that sense, because it helps you question first and then arrive at a set of priorities, goals, values, things like that. And so Stoicism asks you to consider carefully why you value certain things. Are there things that actually are more important, more valuable than others? Of course, the Stoics have an answer to those questions, right? It's not that they're just telling you to, okay, wonder about it. They tell, if you really think about it, it turns out that this is more important than what you, specifically, they would say living according to reason. It is using your reason to solve your problems, and being pro-social, that is being cooperative with other people. Those are the things that really make you happy.
Philosophy as a term is love of wisdom.
Love of wisdom, exactly.
Yeah. And what you just mentioned is sounds a lot like CBT, which is
it does, yeah, but it's a broader umbrella than the CBT.
Yeah.
CBT, it works because it's about specific techniques to be used on specific problems. The philosophy is broader, it's more general.
But do you think that the psychotherapy as itself, going week after week for decades sometimes, this is a problem? This is making you...
I think that's a problem. It makes you dependent on the psychotherapist. You're clearly not making progress, because otherwise you wouldn't keep going. Yeah. Right. It's like you tend to have discussions about the same topics over and over and over again, and you're never actually getting anywhere. Yeah. So I think that is problematic, but it's not a problem that extends to all of psychology. Psychology is complex. It's a difficult field, for one thing, because psychologists are concerned with literally what, so far as we know, is the most complex thing in the universe, which is the human brain. Yeah. And its social interactions with other people. So it's no surprise that some psychology doesn't work, or they don't, it's difficult.
What about psychiatric antidepressants and stuff like that? What do you think?
Yeah, psychiatrics is undergoing also some criticism, over reliance on drugs that may or may not work. It's again difficult. The general notion that certain chemicals have positive effects on the brain is a given. That's just true. There's no question about it. I mean, our own brain produces chemicals that affect its own working, right? Uh, we release adrenaline, for instance. Our brain releases adrenaline when we're facing a potential threat. Um, it's releasing pleasure hormones when we do something right, that we need to incentivize ourselves for in the future. So there's no question that the human brain responds to chemicals. And so the idea of psychiatry, generally speaking, is to figure out which chemicals might be helpful for people who suffer from a particular condition, bipolarism, depression, or whatever it is. So I don't think that there's anything wrong with the basic idea. The implementation is complicated because it's difficult to do large experiments. This is costly. It's difficult to have proper controls because human beings are very difficult experimental subjects. They're not plants or insects. They know what's going on. They can guess at what's going on, which messes up the results of the experiment because they can second guess the experimenter. I think he's going there, so I'm reacting in this way, either consciously or subconsciously. So it's very difficult. Psychiatry needs to be taken at the moment with a grain of salt. I think it does have its purpose, especially when combined with cognitive behavioral therapy, with some kind of evidence-based psychotherapy. But more importantly, I think even under the best of circumstances, a psychiatrist cannot solve your life problems. It can only help you bring your brain, your mind down to a stable, functional level so that you can tackle your problems, right? But if your problem is, I'm not happy in my relationships, let's say, or in my career choices, no pill is going to solve that. You need philosophy. You need to think about stuff. You need to reflect critically about your choices and why you're making them and how you can make them better. Yes, in order to do that, you need a mind that works within normal parameters, so to speak. And sometimes chemicals are useful for that, but you need to be careful.
What do you think Stoics, specifically the big ones we mentioned, would have said about our society and our dependence on such chemicals and stuff like that?
Yeah, they would not have been happy
Oh, yeah.
about that, right? They would have been. I mean, look, people have actually used drugs, mind-altering drugs, forever, including in Roman times. So they will be familiar with things like basic stuff like just wine, for instance. That's a drug that alters your mind, especially if you drink too much. To actual specific drugs. I mean, Marcus Aurelius, for instance, interestingly, was taking opioids because he was in pain. He suffered from chronic pains, and Galen, his physician, gave him a concoction of opioids for managing the pain.
But during his all
During his last years of his life, he was suffering from some kind of ailment. It's not clear exactly what it was, but it caused chronic pain. And
he was taking them daily or something.
yeah, well, we don't know exactly.
Yeah,
but yes, probably
something like that.
under medical supervision. Yeah, under medical supervision. So it's not that the Stoics have anything a priori against medications. If something is going to be helpful, and you can control that thing as opposed to that thing controlling you, you're fine. You're good. In fact, one of the sayings of the ancient Stoics that we find in a commentator named Diogenes Laertius. Diogenes Laertius was a 2nd century commentator on a number of philosophies. He also wrote about Stoicism. He wrote this fascinating book called The Lives of the Eminent Philosophers. And there is a chapter 7, that is all about Stoicism in that book. And he says, Stoics drink wine, but they don't get drunk. And that summarizes this notion that it's okay to, drink for pleasure or take opioids for managing the pain, so long as you are the one that is in control. Not the wine. Yes, not the wine. That's right. You don't let the wine or the opioids take over. And that sometimes can be difficult, right? Epictetus is a little bit more strict. There are differences between the different Stoics in the way they approach things. Epictetus tends to be a little bit more strict. He says to students, look, guys, you're not ready for temperance, for self-control. You just don't know how to control yourselves. So just don't do it. The easiest way, which is confirmed by modern psychological research, the easiest way to control yourself is not to expose yourself at all to a temptation. The typical example is, if you have a problem with sweets, let's say, right? You don't want to go to the supermarket, get a gelato, ice cream, something, and put in your refrigerator, and then say to yourself, "Oh, I'm not gonna eat it, much, and only once in a while." But why? Because then you have a constant temptation, right? Every minute of the day or night, that the ice cream is going to be in the freezer, and you can just get up and reach for it. So what psychologists say is, like, what you need to do is once a week, let's say, when you go to the supermarket, just make that decision of avoiding that island target, not even come close to it. So that you just skip it. It's well labeled. You know where the ice cream is. Just skip it. All you need to do therefore, is to resist temptation once a week for a few minutes. Then it's no longer at home, right?
Yeah.
If you don't have it at home, it's going to be difficult for you to just in the middle of the night say, "Oh, I want ice cream. I'm going to get up. I'm going to dress myself. I'm going to get the car. I'm going to drive to this." You're not going to do that.
That's fascinating. Yeah, I don't know if you know the book Atomic Habits by James Clear, which it's a very popular self-help book, but in a coincidence, perhaps it mentions something like that about creating habits and unhabiting yourself of an habit by the easier the thing is, the more likely you are to make an habit out of it.
Correct.
So just like you said in the ice cream, if you move it out of the house, it will be easy.
You make it more difficult. Yeah, that's right. Make it more difficult for you to do the wrong thing, and therefore easier for yourself to do the right thing. Yeah, there is a large body of psychological literature that supports this, and the ancient Stoics had the same intuition. Obviously, they didn't do controlled experiments about this stuff, but they were good observers of human behavior, and so they realized, in the case of Epictetus, says, just skip it.
Yeah.
Just stay away from it. It's easier than if you expose yourself constantly to the temptation. Because one of these days you're going to just give in.
That's fascinating. I want to go back to power, if I may.
Sure.
What do you think? I think one of the biggest lessons I took from meditation is the temptation of power and how to manage it, because he wrote it, Marcus Aurelius, as an emperor. What do you think is the thing with power these days? We mentioned the word, quote, "power corrupts," and absolute power corrupts absolutely, but in the day-to-day life, in every individual's life.
So the problem with power is that at least some individuals really seem to seek it.
Yeah.
Right. And I don't think it's everybody. I mean, sure, everybody enjoys the ability to make decisions on their own, which is a form of power, essentially, right? But most of us just don't go after power for power's sake. Only certain individuals do it. And that is why I think research shows that a lot of politicians and a lot of people that work on the financial sector in Wall Street level, high level finances, they tend to have a psychological profile that can be described as sociopathic. In other words, they're not the kind of people you actually want in power. But so that, I think, creates the problem. That is, power is sought by people who really shouldn't be in a position of power because they're more likely to abuse it. So we have, I think, a systemic problem. It's not just an individual one. Each one of us can and should work, of course, on our own priorities and ask ourselves critically, why do I want this? Maybe I should be directing my attention to something else. That's perfectly good stuff to do. But let's not forget that we're not isolated individuals. We live within a context.
We're not in a vacuum.
Yeah, we don't live in a vacuum. We live in a context that includes structures, political structures, power structures, and so on and so forth. And those need to be addressed. It's the incentives, for instance, especially in modern American politics, the incentives are exactly the wrong ones. If you think about it, there is now so much money that is needed to stay in politics, to be successful as a politician. Therefore, all effective purposes, politicians have to sell themselves immediately.
Yeah,
as soon as they start.
Yeah, you took power in the direction of politics,
Yes.
but perhaps should one aspire to become powerful in his own life? You can create bombs and you can create hospitals.
Right.
Power, yeah.
Right. So power, according to the Stoics, is, and this is the time I suppose to talk about this particular topic. Power is indifferent. So the Stoics mean, let me be clear, because the word indifferent, unfortunately, as the original Greek is translated into English, it's problematic because you say, oh, indifference, and that means I shouldn't care about it.
Yeah.
No, that's not what it means. Because, for instance, indifference, according to the Stoics, include power, reputation, wealth, education, health, and all that sort of stuff. Now, clearly, these are not things we don't care about. I very much care about my education, my health, being wealthy enough to afford an apartment in Brooklyn, that sort of stuff. So it's not that we don't care. They're not indifferent in the sense that they don't have value or we don't care about them. They're indifferent in the sense that they literally do not make a difference, which is the root of the word indifferent, right? They do not make a difference. To what? To the only thing that, according to the Stoics, matter, which is virtue.
Virtue, yeah. We haven't mentioned this.
We haven't mentioned the V word yet. Now, virtue for the Stoics specifically is made of two components, the two things that I mentioned briefly earlier, reason and prosociality. So the notion, so to be virtuous for a Stoic means you're using your brain, your mind to solve problems, as opposed to violence, for instance, or corruption or whatever it is. And you do so in a way that is prosocial, that is good for other people. That's what it means for a Stoic to be virtuous, to be rational and prosocial. Okay. Everything else is indifferent, meaning that it doesn't make a difference to virtue. In fact, it's kind of the opposite. It's virtue that makes a difference to the so-called indifferent. The Stoics talk about preferred and dispreferred indifference. Right? So there are some indifferent that are preferred because they have positive value, and other indifferents that are dispreferred because they have negative value. Now, even some modern Stoics make a mistake at this point, and so I like to be as clear as I can. You hear a lot of modern Stoics say that, for instance, money is a preferred indifferent because you would rather have money than not. That's not exactly right. Money is an indifferent, period. It becomes preferred if you use it wisely or virtuously, and it becomes dispreferred if you use it unwisely or unvirtuously. The same goes with power. You just said, you have power, you can build hospitals or you can bomb the hell out of people.
Yeah.
Right. The first is preferred, and the second one is dispreferred, according to the Stoics, right? So power in and of itself is neutral. It's not something that you should either seek or stay away from. It's completely neutral. What makes it a good thing or a bad thing is, what are you going to do with that power? If you're using that power in order to help people, build hospitals, let's say, then sure, you should go after it. Absolutely. If on the other hand you're tempted to use power for bad things, such as bombing people or corrupt the political system or whatever it is, then no, it becomes dispreferred. You should stay away from it.
So it needs to be in accordance with virtue.
Correct. And the same goes for all of the other indifference, right? So health is preferred if you're using it for good things, but nobody wants a healthy Hitler, for instance.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Because he's going to do bad things with that health. Relationships are preferred if they are based on virtue, respect, common, reciprocal growth and all that. But if it become abusive or too much one-sided and so on, then they become dispreferred. Education is a preferred indifferent if it's sound education, if it's you're actually learning things that are useful for humanity at large. But education can also be bad because you may be educated in a way that it's actually contrary to the notion of being helpful to people, and so on and so forth. So everything that is not virtue is indifferent, and that indifferent is positive or negative depending on how do you use it, and therefore whether you're using virtuously or not.
This really, made my brain get understand the concept as better, as good as it can be.
That is why I mentioned, if you remember a few minutes ago, the Euthydemus, this dialogue by Plato that I was rereading on my way here. And there is a great argument that Socrates makes. Socrates was essentially an ancestor of the Stoics. The Stoics followed themselves as Socratic, as following Socrates. And Socrates in the Euthydemus makes exactly this argument. He says, counterintuitively, that wisdom is the only guarantor of happiness. You're going to be happy only if you're wise. Right? Like, what? And so he explains. He says, well, there's a friend that he's talking to in the dialogue. He says, well, think about it. You think that money is going to make you happy? Well, that depends on how you use it. You think that health is going to make you happy? Well, that depends on how you use it, and so on and so forth. So he's making the same exact argument that the Stoics are making. So wisdom becomes the true source of happiness, according to Socrates, because it is wisdom that makes you use properly whatever it is that life gives you, health, wealth, and so on.
The thing about from Buddhism in this regard, in regard to wisdom as a knife, which you can raise sharply and you can use it to benefit or only to harm. And you should be careful with wisdom.
Yes, that's right. Now, so that's another area where the Stoics disagree with the Buddhists. They would say that wisdom, by definition, can only be used for good things. If you don't use it for good things, then it's not wisdom. Right? Now you're doing something else. But the Buddhist analogy with the knife is correct. It's the Stoics would use that analogy to talk about the indifference, however, not about wisdom. The indifferent is like a knife. You can use it for cutting things that you need to cut, or you can use it to kill somebody.
Yeah.
Clearly, the first use is a good one. The second use is not a good one. So that's what makes that applies for the Stoics. It applies to the indifference, not to wisdom. Wisdom is what tells you how to use things properly. Socrates, as usual, when he makes arguments, he uses a bunch of analogies. So it doesn't just come out and say, wisdom is the one that, the thing that gives you happiness. Before he gets there, that's the conclusion. Before he gets there, he gives you a number of examples that apparently have nothing to do with what you're talking about, when they're talking about. For instance, in this case, he says, let's say that you are a worker, you're doing some kind of, you're making pots, let's say. And you have all the instruments that are necessary to make pots. Is that enough? Yes, his friend, right? Is that what make you a good potter? The fact that you have the tools, and the guy's inspired for saying, no. Okay, what else is missing? Well, you have to be able to use those tools. Correct. So it has to be a skill. You're a writer. Okay, so you have pens. Great. Is a pen enough to make you a good writer? No. You have to know how to use the pen. You can use the pen badly, and you're going to be a bad writer, even so you may have the same instruments as another person, but if you don't know how to use them properly, that is not going to achieve what you want to achieve. It's not going to get you your goal.
I see it all the time with podcasting. Many people buy the equipment.
Exactly.
They're not very.
But if you don't have the skills,
they're not working on skill.
In fact, Socrates goes so far as saying, you would be better off with bad tools and good skills than the other way around.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And as you mentioned before, you got a flow state. Yeah. This is how I judge good podcast that I'm making, which I'm losing sense of time and become flow.
That's right.
But yeah,
Exactly.
this is what I think happened right now. 2 hours gone by without even noticing. So we are at our final destination. I wanted to ask one last question before sort of finishing this podcast, which was amazing. And thank you so much again for being here.
Thank you.
What's the best advice you've ever been given about mental health in your life?
Interesting question. At the cost of sort of repeating something that we actually already said, I really think the best advice I ever got was from Epictetus.
Oh, really?
And right at the beginning of the Enchiridion, when he tells you to pay attention to things that are up to you and to develop an attitude of acceptance and equanimity toward the things that are not up to you. That book, the Epictetus, in general, but those two books, the Discourses and the Enchiridion, they literally changed my life. This was when I got interested in Stoicism a good number of years ago. Those just happened to be the first two things that I read from the Stoics, right? Before I got to Marcus Aurelius, before I got to Seneca, before I got to other texts.
It's not the usual path.
No, it's right. It's not the usual path. Epictetus was my introduction to this Stoicism. And I remember people told me, some people who were further ahead than I was on the path to Stoicism told me, don't read the Enchiridion, don't start with the Enchiridion. One of the major mistakes that people make is to look at the Enchiridion first because it's short. Right? It's only 53 paragraphs. It's like, oh, I can do that in an afternoon. And then I'm a Stoic. But the problem with that is that the Enchiridion, as I said before, it's actually a very condensed summary of the discourses. So you're missing all the context of what's going on. And so you read parts of the Enchiridion and you have no idea why Epictetus is saying what he's saying. Like, what the heck? What is this thing? For instance, let me give you one example. There is a passage in the Enchiridion early on, I think it's the second or third section, where Epictetus says, remember, when you go to bed, kiss your wife and your child goodnight because they might die. That way, you're not disturbed. It's like, you read that thing and he said, and that's it. That's all it says. It doesn't give any other explanation, right? You read that thing and say, this guy's a psychopath. What do you mean I shouldn't be disturbed by the fact that my wife or my child might die? But if you read the same general concept in the discourses, it makes a lot more sense. First of all, because you have to remember that Epictetus was alive at a time where people really did die suddenly overnight. That you mentioned earlier that Marcus Aurelius buried several of his children, and he was the emperor, so he was one of the most privileged people. The most privileged person in the world at the time. Certainly not. That was not applying, to regular folks or to slaves like Epictetus. So first of all, that puts it into context. It's like, okay, he's talking about a situation that was actually very common, unfortunately, at the time. But also in the discourses, he uses a different phrasing, which makes more sense. He says, you will not go to pieces. But it doesn't tell you that you shouldn't be disturbed, as in, it shouldn't bother. The fact that your wife or your child are dying shouldn't bother you. That's not what he's saying. He's saying it shouldn't fall into pieces. It shouldn't go into pieces, which is completely different. It basically says you need to accept that this is a reality and act accordingly. Do your best. If your wife just died, then now it's time to take care of your children. If your child died, now it's time to take care of your wife. So in context, this whole thing makes a lot more sense. So do not start with the Enchiridion. Start with the discourses. That's what I did. And one of the very first passages in the first section of the discourses talks about money. Because one of these students asks Epictetus about, so what about money? Isn't that a good thing? And he says, well, is it? I mean, who is going to tell you whether money is a good thing? Not money itself. Money itself doesn't talk. It's your faculty of judgment, your prohairesis, that tells you whether something is good or not, or how to use it or not use it. And therefore, that's what you need to focus your attention on. Not in making money, because that's secondary, on what you're going to do with the money once you have it. Because if the answer is not the right one, then you're better off actually not making one. So that sentence right there just caught me. It's like, oh wow, who is this guy, and why did I never hear about him before? I mean, I took graduate level classes in ancient philosophy when I was doing my PhD in philosophy, and I never heard of Epictetus. And the reason for that is because he was incredibly popular throughout the last 1800 years. I mean, he was always in people's mind. Some of the founding fathers of the American Republic, like George Washington, Jefferson, Adams, and so on, they all knew about Epictetus. There's a nice letter that Adams writes to his wife and says, no, so remember what Epictetus says in the discourses. So it was very popular. It was a household name up until the 19th century included. Then in the 20th century, philosophy kind of took a different turn. It became much more specialized field. It became much more technical. And the notion of philosophy as a way of life kind of got set aside for a number of decades, which I think it was unfortunate. Now it's coming back. Now even professional philosophers are beginning to pay attention to this notion of philosophy as a way of life. And so Epictetus is in fact, again, becoming a more well-known figure.
And the thing about his message was, pay attention to the things that you can control. This is the best advice he's ever been given.
Come on. Wow. And that really did. So it was just like the light bulb came on. Yes, absolutely. This guy is absolutely right. So let me read the rest.
Yeah.
Let me read what else he says. And every time that I read the discourses, it takes me a long time. It's not a really long book. It's 4 chapters. It's not a very long book, but it takes me forever because I meditate and reflect on almost every passage.
Yeah.
It's so dense in terms of what he says that you could, again, not necessarily read it cover to cover. You just open up a section. The sections have different titles, which tell you something about the topic that he's talking about. And if that particular title strikes you as interesting, you just read that section. And then you close it, set it aside, open it again, go to a different section.
Amazing. Tom, okay. Massimo, thank you so much for being here.
It was a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much.